Good evening, one and all, and it's a great pleasure to see so many of you today at the Business and Economics group joining for this particular topic, the liminal space, the in-between. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Farooq Mughal, who is an organizational studies scholar with a particular interest in liminality. As far as I'm concerned, given that my interests at the BLSI are all about business and economics as your convener, but also as in philosophy as co-convener, I think liminality and the conversation we will be having today will be really interesting, because liminality is one of these subjects that actually transcend disciplines across all specters of society. And it is something that really is very little talked about, although it is present in our everyday lives. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Farooq Mughal.
Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be here today. Such an amazing platform that you've organized, and I've been actually looking forward to our conversation. And what I'm really looking forward is to the Q&A session, because I can keep going on about liminality and organization studies, but I think the true essence lies in what's going to come afterwards in our conversation. But I think it's a great honor for me to be here as part of this event and this initiative, and I would be more than happy to talk about what I've been doing in my research and how I have been using, along with colleagues, this concept of liminality, particularly from management and organization studies. So, and while discussing and explaining different aspects of liminality, please do forgive me, and I was saying this earlier, if I go off on a tangent, because my ideas can be provocative as well as they can spin off in different directions. But thank you very much for having me here.
Excellent. Well, listen, I mean, as I highlighted already, I think this is a very exciting subject for me, particularly with my sort of business background as well. But before we get into this, why don't you give us a little bit more of an introduction to Farooq and your background and what you do at Bath University?
Right. So I'm an assistant professor in strategy and organization at the School of Management here at the University of Bath. I joined Bath back in 2017. I did my PhD, my doctorate in management learning and leadership from Lancaster University Management School, where I also completed a postgraduate degree. I also, after my PhD, I was working as a postdoctoral research fellow with the Academy of Gender Work and Leadership at Lancaster University Management School. So I've been in Lancaster for a very long time. I have a very strong affiliation with them. I'm working with colleagues from Lancaster on this project that I'm doing that involves liminality. Right. But I've been passionate about business, and I've been passionate about organizations. One of my passions has been to understand how are we developing our new breed of managers or executives who are leaving universities, and how are they going to take up these very important roles as managers and leaders in organizations when they transition. So the key word here is transition. I'm going to come back to that later on in our conversation. So how do they transition from the school to the workplace? But my research has evolved over the past few years, and especially being here at Bath. So now, at the moment, my research revolves around sense-making and identity-based approaches in the context of role transitions and the kind of boundary work we're doing in order to acquire core memberships of these organizations or social groups or communities that kind of are trying to make way for these individuals to be part of them. But at the core of this intellectual endeavor lies a focus on how people learn to navigate, to negotiate and connect with work and non-work issues, and therefore it takes my research to different domains, and I keep moving from one domain to the other. But the interest and the value of my research lies what happens in between two domains. So yeah, this is some of my research that I'm currently doing.
Excellent. Well, and I think this is a good segue into the first and probably the most obvious question, which is, what is liminal space, and why are you using this as a backdrop to a changing world in business?
in order for me to actually answer this, let me start by saying that liminality refers to something universal. It's something that we often experience in our lives when our self-concepts or our ideas about ourselves are challenged, and or we experience conflict when we interact with new ideas. So liminality in simple terms is the experience of finding oneself at a boundary or in a betwixt position, which is neither here nor there. So to many people, including the students I teach or researchers I work with, it sounds like a very complicated but an interesting concept. But before I kind of try explaining this concept of a liminal space, I was hoping that I would offer some brief background on how this concept of liminality has in fact emerged, and especially for those of you who are interested in this concept of liminality. So the term liminality is an interesting concept, and it can be traced back to the writings of a French anthropologist, Arnold van Gennep, who I think in early 1900s wrote his famous book called The Rites of Passage. And in this book, van Gennep writes that all kind of initiation or rites of passage, for example, from going out from childhood to being an adult, from having power to giving up power, from occupying one social role to taking up another social role, has three phases. The first is separation. So in this phase, the individual is detached or being detached from their preceding social status or social position and progressing towards attaining a new form of identity. For example, from growing out as a boy to becoming a man. Some scholars have argued that this detachment can be agonizing for individuals who are seeking. And we were having this conversation just before we started this session, that we tried to hold on to our previous identities, and when we're moving forward, in this process of separation or moving forward can be really difficult for individuals. And sometimes when we think that our concepts are being challenged, we try to resist taking on new identities and roles. So that the first phase is separation. That's what van Gennep writes in his book. The second phase is what we call the middle or the liminal space. Yep. And once individuals start separating or detaching themselves from their previous identity position or state of being, for example, they're now in a transitionary phase, in a liminal state, passing through a domain that is in between. Right, so this is where the idea of liminality lies. It's in this middle phase, and what van Gennep says is the third phase is reintegration. Yeah. Here, the individual finally starts to incorporate a new sense of being, and I think at this point in time, the individual is hovering at the boundary and is trying to seek their way to the core of that different identity group, that different organization that they seek to be part of, and they're doing a lot of boundary work. And then the most interesting thing here is from a historical point of view, and I'm not a liminality scholar, so I'm a management scholar, but I'm interested in liminality. So these ideas about separating, liminality, and reintegration really deeply moved this British anthropologist called Victor Turner, who was particularly interested in this concept of liminality or the liminal space, where you're neither here nor there. And in Victor's terms, or his infamous terms, you are in a betwixt, in-between position. So once we kind of get separated from our social position or our identity group and enter into what van Gennep calls the rites of passage or the liminal space, you have not yet gotten your new identity, but you're slowly losing your old habits. At this point, you are in between, or what I consider as a critical scholar is the most vulnerable time of your life. Because when we're transitioning, so your question was, what is a liminal space? So when we're part of a liminal space, we're transitioning and we're letting go of some of our past, embracing the future. And here, a lot of mainstream scholars suggest that we're open to new ideas.
Yeah.
We're most vulnerable to new influences in our lives. And some of my work argues that once you're starting to learn these new behaviors or ideas, or when these influences are taking a toll on you and your identity position starts changing or tries to enter a new phase, it's not necessarily that you are positioned right at the center. Yes. You need to do a lot of boundary work, and you need to do a lot of identity work for you to really move from that position. So what happens in a liminal space is that you're trying to locate yourself, and this is what I've come to know about it. And in so doing, we're doing a lot of intensive identity work. So this identity work is around taking a particular identity position.
That's very interesting. I mean, obviously, traditional management theory will talk about something called the sort of unfreezing, reshaping, and refreezing, which is very sequential. It's not really a process. You're moving very smoothly from one state to another. So, tell us a little bit more about liminality as a sort of an ongoing and emergent process. I
think what you've just referred to is Kurt Lewin's famous 3-step change model, which starts with unfreezing. And I think there are a lot of commonalities between thinking about change and liminality itself, because liminality is deeply linked with the idea of change, because what change does is, and I'm sure you've been a consultant, you would know that change incorporates fear, and there's a fear of uncertainty. And one of the things that we as humans don't like is what is uncertain. So what liminality does is, or when we're trying to change from one position to the other, and when we're stuck in this betwixt position, I think we must take liminality as a dynamic process. And it can take a lot longer for some people to transition. For example, some children might take a lot longer to transition into being adults, or some might take a lot longer to transition into a new management position. So I think we fear change, but I think it's really important for us to understand the liminal experience, because liminal experience kind of sets the basis for change. Or in Kurt Lewin's terms, the liminal state would be the change, the state of change when we're changing. And it corresponds to that. And reintegration would be the refreezing stage. So when we assume a particular identity position, we start freezing ourselves. We kind of embrace new ideas. But then another change might come around and we start being in a liminal space. So it's a dynamic process.
Yes, and you've already talked about the different phases of liminality. Can you say something about the sort of different dimensions of liminality?
I think this question is interesting because this idea of there's a lot of debate in literature around what actually constitutes a liminal space. Yeah. So this puts me in a precarious position as a management scholar using liminality, but I think there practically, I don't think there's a clear demarcation when liminality starts, when it ends. This, I think, becomes quite problematic in the identification of dimensions of a liminal space. But to answer your question, I think it depends. In our research, we've developed a set of questions, let's just say, for the sake of conversation. So to answer your question, I think it depends on how liminality is experienced, where it is experienced, with whom it is experienced, and for how long it is experienced. Yeah. So these questions are kind of helpful in identifying this idea of liminality or being in a liminal space. But now, for the sake of provocation, as a critical scholar, I consider liminality to have a subjective and arguably an objective dimension. Right. Now here, people who already have some insights around liminality might consider, well, this doesn't really liminality. How can it have an objective dimension? So I consider liminality to have a subjective and objective dimension. Subjectively, it could depend on the kinds of emotions liminality elicits psychologically, which triggers past feelings, experiences, and prior knowledge. Because when we're separating ourselves from our past identities, it's an uneasy process. And like you've said, you've referred to Kurt Levin's 3-step model of change. We fear change, and we don't want to let go of our past identities. So it kind of induces our psychological fears. But I think subjectively, it depends on how liminality is experienced, like individually or in a group. At the moment, as a society, collectively, we're experiencing a liminal state. So we're caught up in a liminal state at the moment. So we're experiencing this collectively as well as individually. But objectively, I think liminality could have 2 subdimensions, which we use in our research as well. One is temporality, the other is spatiality, time and space. And of course, it depends on the kind of transition we're looking at when we're talking about liminality. For example, if a traveler is traveling from one country to the other, and they're transiting at an international airport or an international lounge in a third country, we can say that the international lounge is a liminal space for that traveler, because they're experiencing the space of being in a liminal zone. Yeah. And it can have a temporal dimension as well. How long are you experiencing this state of liminality? And there are a lot of factors which kind of speed up the process of transition. I think the duration of liminality is directly proportional to the nature of change individuals are trying to experience or negotiate. But then again, I'm not a pure science scholar. I'm a management scholar. And then again, there are numerous factors that kind of influence the rate at which people transition. But for me, I would use the subjective and objective dimensions as a measure for liminality.
No, that's great. I think that sort of raises another question, I suppose, is how important is it that actually the individual realizes that he or she is in a liminal space for her or him to actually effect an effective transformation to the next phase?
I think that's a brilliant question, because it's very difficult for us to understand when we are getting into a liminal zone. Yeah. And I think here the role of professionals or organizations or managers is really important. Particularly, I work with young people from business schools, and I look at how they are transitioning. And I think when I look at them, not a lot of them know that they're in a liminal space, but unconsciously they're involved or engaged in a number of identity construction practices. So interestingly, when I look at these students when they're transitioning into the workplace and when they're doing their internships, which is kind of a liminal space. So in our work, we theorize internships as a liminal space, going back to the objective dimension. So when they're suspended in this liminal space, and they're trying to acquire these rites of passage to enter the job market and become more employable, they're engaged in a lot of identity practices. And some of these identity practices are triggered because they're either asked to conform to certain identity labels, or they resist conforming to those identity labels, or some of them adapt to those identity labels as they're moving into the job market. So going back to your question, tying up that why am I studying liminality and how is it important for an individual to transform? I think in the backdrop of changing world of work, I think it is becoming more and more important to understand the dynamics of this transitory space or the liminal space, where the usual, the normal practices are suspended. We're hung in this limbo. And I think individuals who understand that their ideas of who they are and how they fit in are being challenged, and then they start raising these questions and they reflect on their experience. I think for them, they start getting to know that they need to do something different. And for me, when they start doing something different, for me, it kind of triggers this idea of being in a liminal space, because now you're saying what I know so far isn't applicable or isn't entirely applicable in what I'm doing. So I need to learn something new. So in order for me to learn something new, I look at different people, for example, in my workplace. I would like to I like to see them as role models. So I try mimicking them, or I say, no, I don't want to be them. I have my own personality.
Yeah.
And I think when we're trying to unpack some of these conflicting situations, I think then we kind of know that we're trying to change, we're trying to transition, but not in a liminal sense.
Oh, no, absolutely. But I think it would be, I'm just picking up on the word you mentioned earlier, and this talks about the dynamics of transformation. Right. And transition, and understanding that in a little bit more detail. Maybe you can talk to that in terms of what are the dynamics around transition.
I think one of the most important things that I feel that's really important is that since my research is not just limited to young people, I also look into how people transition from one role to another in life. For example, from acquiring a job to leaving a job. And I think having an understanding of how individuals are transitioning and then negotiating with their liminal experiences is really important. So this experience, I think, for me as an individual, to understand the dynamics of liminality, as individuals, as human beings, we often try to appraise ourselves or evaluate ourselves in terms of a moving target. And that moving target is a role. That role can be in our family, in our non-work domains, can be in our work domains. So we think about a role, for example, being a manager in an organization or being a father at home. So we look into those roles and then we try to evaluate our experiences. Are we a good father? Are we a good manager? And that kind of, and when we start thinking about those roles, their role dynamics then. Those dynamics then make us think about relationships. It make us think about our positionality, make us think about our past experiences, and how good are those past experiences in fulfilling those roles as a manager or as a parent, for example. So I think liminality is closely related to the kinds of roles we aspire, and the dynamics that come forward of being in a liminal space are in fact the role dynamics. Yeah. And if you're uncertain about our roles, the dynamics tend to be a lot more stronger and they're more strongly felt. But right. When we start thinking that, well, we are doing very good in our roles and we aspire to be a manager and we understand what are the dynamics of being a manager, so we're more relaxed and we try to transition more quickly through the liminal state.
Well, maybe. Obviously, you've done a lot of research into this, Farooq. I mean, maybe you can give some sort of very specific examples around the sort of identity transitioning. You know, this sort of change from being to becoming, or some concrete and very specific examples in your research.
Right. So I think one of the things that I've been doing so far with my with these young people that I've been working with is that what I start looking into is that when these people are put in a situation where their previous knowledge and experiences don't really help them understand their situations. So in business schools, we teach a lot of theory. And when they step into the practical world, these young people, a lot of times they think, well, these theoretical concepts aren't quite applicable. So there is a disconnect. And when they start feeling this disconnect between their past knowledge and where they are, it kind of puts them in a very precarious position. And what they're trying to do in this point in time, they're trying to learn from their new experiences. Yeah. So I think from being a student to becoming, there is a very important role of identity learning as well. So in order to assume a particular identity, in order to become someone we aspire, I think identity learning is really important. And it's not something that happens to us, but something that we're trying to construct. And these individuals, these young people that we work with, they're trying to construct their new sense of being, and they're using a lot of personal social resources. And when I say personal, it means they're drawing on their past experiences of being individuals, being part of complex human systems in our society, but they're also trying to kind of draw on some of their social resources by talking to people, by interacting with them, by constructing or deconstructing their experiences of where they are. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that the students we learn, they're agentic beings. And they have the agency to develop certain conceptions about becoming someone. Because when I talk to these students, as when they're with their fresh minds, and they aspire to be professionals.
Yes.
But when you talk to them, when you ask them, what are your goals after being an intern? What are you looking at? We're aspiring to be managers. We're aspiring to be leaders, for example. And when they're aspiring to be someone, and when they feel that during their interstructural journey, so liminality is basically an interstructural journey between two different structures, or caught in two different domains.
Yep.
I think they're experimenting with their identities. So that's what we've come to know. They're reflecting on their past experiences, and they're trying to look into other people and trying to see that if they're being seen in a very particular way. And this problem of being suspended in a liminal space, if you're not able to transition out of a liminal space, maybe due to a number of different reasons, we can actually develop negative experiences of our work behavior. And these negative work experiences can lead to fractured identities and reduces individuals' career visibility. So it's important for us to understand that how are they learning new behavior at work. And in our research, we've come across to three types of liminal identities, or what we call provisional identities.
Yeah.
And not a lot of research has been done around liminal identities, right? So normally when we talk about identity work, or we talk about transitions, we look into very stable domains. Like at point A, this individual is a student. At point B, this individual is a professional. But what happens in between? So in between, these individuals that we've studied say that they're constructing liminal identities. And these identities are vessels for them to learn. And there are three identity positions that we've come across. Some of them say that they're confused about their identity position, and they don't know what they want to become, or should they comply to the different pressures that they are open to, because they're vulnerable in a liminal position. The second position that we've come to know of is that some of them consider themselves as recognized insiders. They conform to different identity labels, to different identity pressures, and they try to act like someone they've seen at their workplace or they've seen in their other life. But there's a third category. Some people do not fully conform, and these individuals who are aspiring to be employable in the future, to be professionals, they do not fully conform, but they try adapting. One of the most vulnerable categories in all of this is the confused outsider.
Yeah.
So if they are the ones who can be marginalized.
Yeah.
And for them, liminality is felt more strongly than the other identity positions, because if we are unable to mentor them, support them, I think they will, at least in our research, we feel that they have a very reduced visibility of their careers.
No, very interesting. Very interesting. I could be veering off now. I won't, but I could be veering off into identity and personality theory and all sorts, which would be very interesting. But I think for me, the next question really for me is that how important is it that people realize that they're actually going through a liminal space effectively continuously, but the moments of truth in that liminal space vary significantly over time and for different situations?
So there are a lot of previous studies around how people transition out of different liminal spaces. One of the most common studies around careers and in life stages, and how people transition out of these liminal spaces, such as child going out of their adolescence and becoming a teenager, and similarly people changing jobs and work roles. But for me, I think transitioning is becoming more and more constantly becoming more and more difficult in this day and age.
Yeah.
And one of the things is that for me, I think transitioning is becoming difficult because, for example, we're going through this pandemic, and this is kind of a reckoning that I was talking about earlier, that has really pushed us off in a different way, in a different world, where we're constantly now rethinking about our normal ways of doing. So we are in a liminal space, right? So I think this pandemic has pushed us further into a very different world, and I think in order to avoid for us to be continuously trapped in a liminal paradox forever, where we are constantly in a recursive identity spin. So we're continuously constructing and reconstructing ourselves. I think it's important for us to avoid being part of that. And it's really difficult to transition out of that recursive spin because it's a paradoxical situation. And this is in fact becoming more and more difficult for young people as well, because given the digital world that we live in at the moment, because of the digital social media, there's so many influences. They're constantly taking us in different directions. So at any given point in time, so I'm not saying that at any given point in time we're holding on to only one identity. We're holding on to multiple identities about ourselves and how we look at ourselves. But we're constantly being pulled into different directions. So in order for us to really achieve a coherent sense of self is really difficult. So there are different forces that are triggering these changes in us. And like I've said earlier, and when these changes occur, we start appraising ourselves, our experiences, and thinking about ourselves in relation to roles we perform in our daily lives and in our work lives, and in trying to see how do we fit in with what we do. If you're unable to find an answer to that, we are reconstructing ourselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's interesting because, I mean, I mentioned philosophy earlier. I mean, obviously, one of the key people here in terms of existentialism is Jean-Paul Sartre, and his example of the inauthentic and the authentic existence, and the example of the waiter, you know, whose identity becomes the waiter when he's the waiter, and then but then moves on and becomes a completely different identity. To what extent is there a strain or a stress between the identity that the individual will want to achieve versus the identity they need to achieve to get the next job, for example? You know, there must be some sort of stress and issues if the two aren't properly aligned. So what I want as an individual, as an identity, who I want to be seen, etc., is one thing, but the kind of job I need to do to facilitate some of this, it's not really where I see my identity.
First of all, I think in our research, we've seen that students have a very concrete vision of where they want to be after their internships, for example. They have a vision for themselves. They have a vision of who they want to be, who they want to look like, what kind of identity they should have. Yeah. And this is what we call aspirational identity, or desired identity. But the interesting fact is that we found in our research that seldom does it happen that they really acquire what they set off to do. Yeah. So we can see this with a lot of jobs that are insecure, for example, people who do a lot of temporary work, people who are apprentices, or when people are migrating from one country to another or from one job to another, they feel insecure because they can't really hold on to any particular conceptions about themselves. And they're in this betwixt position, like Van Gennep says. So the individuals who get into such existential insecurity is initially unwilling to accept their situation. Yeah. And if you're unwilling to accept this situation, and when you're being forced to relinquish your earlier identity patterns, I think it's very difficult to achieve your aspirational or desired identity. I think most of our interns were found to be regulated adapters of identity rather than recognized insiders, because they did not want to fully conform to different identity or role pressures, but they wanted to be unique as well, to pursue who they are. So I think in our research so far, I think we haven't been able to find people who were able to to quantify this 100%. They were able to achieve what they set out to do.
Yeah. Okay. Now, so far, Farooq, we've talked very much at the individual level,
Right.
but there clearly there's also at an organizational or even a societal level. I think we started talking about some of this in terms of liminality. What are the sort of lessons we can learn in terms of how to manage change in frameworks like Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework, for example?
So I've read about Cynefin framework, and but I'm not fully aware of the literature. But to the extent that I know, I think there are important lessons to be learned.
Right.
But so let's just kind of deconstruct. So you've asked a lot of questions in one question. So first, I think we need to recognize that as humans, we live in a social world. We live in a society which is diverse, which is multidimensional. And as humans, we're living in these complex systems where we adapt to different events, such as the pandemic, which is an extreme example of how we're adapting to a new situation. But however, as a society or as an organization or as a community, we learn through our social interactions, which are deeply rooted in our past.
Yeah.
And letting go of some of our past identities or past knowledge or experiences kind of triggers new set of emotions in us. And we try to make sense of why are we experiencing what we're experiencing at this moment. So we acquire meanings from our social interactions. We meet with different people. We try to understand the change and the changing environment. And like you've said earlier, you referred to Kurt Lewen's 3-step change model, unfreezing, freezing. I think in a real world context, this is easier said than done due to our social complexity, right? It's not easy to achieve change, and transitioning or changing is essentially a social process, right? And since it's a social process, I think transitioning out of one position, I think it's not very easy. And I think you've used an interesting term, Cynefin. Like I've said, I've read about Snowden's framework. I'm not quite familiar, but just to use some of the knowledge that I have is that I think Cynefin refers to, for me, it points me towards the multiplicity of my identity. How am I grounded in multiple relations as an individual? So it kind of makes me think about how am I connected to the work I'm doing, to the interest groups I have, to my social circles, to my family relations. And I think through Cynefin, we can really supplement our sense-making processes rather than I think there's a deep connection between identity work, because we do a lot of identity work to make sense of who we are, right? Yeah. So there's a deep relationship with that. And I think thinking about Cynefin, I think it really supplements our sense-making model. So coming back to your question about lessons, I think Cynefin requires us to think of the organizations as a complex system. And I think it triggers individuals to rethink about who they are. So we can use the knowledge gathered to understand that as professionals helping young interns or young individuals or people transitioning from one position to the other, I think it's recognizing how people learn new behavior, new knowledge. It opens up the possibility for creating change, sustaining change. Yep. I think liminality could be a mechanism, in fact, to enable that change from point one to point B. But I think there are lessons. So the big lesson for me is that we must not neglect the experiences that we have in a liminal phase, because liminal experiences set the foundation for our aspirational desired identities.
Okay. And I suppose, so just looking at the time, maybe time for one quick question from me, and have you got any practical advice for the audience and myself in terms of the steps we can take to be more aware of the liminal space in order to drive different outcomes?
Right. So from what I have come to know from our research with young people is that they are more likely to respond to changes in life on their own by themselves, and they try to cope with changing self-conceptualization in a very precarious manner. And I would suggest that line managers or senior colleagues or professionals in professional services like social care need to support young and inexperienced people who are looking to build a career by offering one-to-one counseling, for example, mentoring or setting up support groups in which they're willing to talk through their liminal experiences. Because when we are vulnerable to a lot of forces, we're also shy about opening up. Yeah. So those organizations who pay very little attention to these young individuals or interns or early career individuals, particularly who fall in the category of what we've identified as confused outsiders, are the ones who are more vulnerable to change. And if they're not supported at this critical stage of their lives, I think it will only develop negative work attitudes. It will develop fractured identities. It will reduce their career visibility, and or even worse, it might induce cynical behavior or antisocial behavior. And then apart from mentoring or counseling, I think it's important, especially in the context of organizations and the interns that they work, it's to empower them to make everyday decisions about their work routines, about their personal schedules, about their careers. And then organizations can formalize these processes because it's not to say that organizations are not developing their talent or they're not looking, but this knowledge is not widely available to understand that how precariously positioned these individuals are. And when they're precariously positioned, I think it carries a risk of developing those very fractured identities, and they might end up with incoherent identities and negative work attitudes. So I think it's important to talk to them about their experiences and offer them more support in terms of developing their careers.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, lots of food for thought there, Farooq. I'm going to unmute everybody so we can all show our appreciation for the conversation. That's been very good. I'm just going to unmute you. I think you're all unmuted now, so maybe we can show our appreciation in the usual way. Very good. We'll now throw it open to questions. I'm going to put you all on gallery view. The only thing you need to do is unmute yourself if you haven't already done so, and show the video. I can see Jean as well. Jean is a expert on complexity theory and has written books on it. So I'm sure, Jean, I saw your question on the chat room. Do you want to ask it in person?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Farooq. That was really interesting. I'm here in Bath too, so I'm involved with the Social and Policy Sciences group at the university. I wanted to make a comment, and then I had a question. So my comment was that the kind of ontological stance of complexity theory is in a sense saying the world is transitions through liminal spaces. So it has the kind of it's not just saying people do. It's saying the nature of reality as it moves from regimes that are relatively stable through and transitions, into something else. So critical junctures, tipping points, regime shifts are all a kind of ontological a description of the nature of reality, of which our personal experience of a liminal space is one manifestation. So I think that's really, it's good. I was interested in hearing you from that perspective. The other thing I wanted to take as slightly as a devil's advocate position, though, was, in a world that is increasingly fast changing and unexpected, in a world that has less large organisations, more small organisations, where we have multiple roles in a whole variety of ways, should we be helping people to find an identity, or should we be helping people to come to terms with the fact that they're always in a process of becoming? So in a sense, we are always in a liminal space to a very, I'm kind of still waiting to find my identity, and it's getting a bit late, I'm in my career, but there's a sort of implicit assumption, if I play devil's advocate in what you're saying, that an identity is a good thing. But in a kind of liminal world, Prigogine, who was one of the founders of complexity theory, wrote a book called From Being to Becoming, and his point was, in a sense, the world is always becoming. It's a Buddhist idea, it's a Taoist idea. So I'm just slightly uncomfortable. I can see politically, if I have a young person who's trying to fit in and have a career, they want to kind of, settle in on identity and then kind of be accepted for who they are. But is that the way of the future? So I'm just not. I want to challenge the idea that identity is a good thing.
No, if I paraphrase you, Jean, you basically are saying is a fixed identity a good thing, and actually does a fixed identity persist throughout time?
And is it because the world doesn't persist? There's complexity. The understanding of the world in flow puts into question
a nice easy question to start with then.
Absolutely. Thank you for the comment, and thank you for listening in. I think in my research I do look into these very critical junctures, which you were saying tipping points, and I like the word tipping points. I'm gonna use this more often now, because it helps me explain more that why are we so intensively trying to reconstruct ourselves because of these tipping points that we kind of deal with in our everyday lives. I think just to start with one of your comment on still finding an identity, or whether identity is kind of a fixed position,
or even a good thing. Is it a good thing even? Should I be wanting an identity?
I think first of all, I think there's a lot of debate in the identity literature itself, where people think about identity either as something that people have, or is it continuously changing? So there's a view that identity can be a dynamic process, and it keeps on evolving as we go along, as we age through in our lives. We are again getting different experiences in life. So our identity really transforms as we move along. In our research, identity wasn't the starting point when we were working with interns. So this is one of our framing of our research, where we're looking into to really understand what these individuals are doing. So we come to understand that what these interns or young people are doing as being interns is that they're searching for who they are and how do they fit in. So they're raising these very important questions, and these questions are not necessarily related to identity, but I think they kind of allude us to a very different reality of the workplace. So we're using identity as a way to suggest that you need to have a certain kind of a position in the workplace to understand political systems in the workplace. How do relationships work? How is work carried out on a day-to-day basis? So in order for us to understand how people are managed, how people work in their roles, I think identity kind of works as a cover for the role that they are assuming. So we're using role as a moving target, but we're using identity work or identity construction practices as a way to understand that how are they actually navigating through this complex work system. So it's not for them to just assume an identity position at the end of their internships. It's more for them to understand how organizations work, how are they understanding their everyday lives within those organizations. So you've rightly pointed out that there are a lot of medium-sized and small organizations in this world. While big firms do have well-established programs, I think most of our interns were from these small and medium organizations. And initially, when they stepped into the workplace, for example, some of them faced a massive reality shock when they started thinking about we don't really know what's happening. How do we make sense of where we are? How do things work? The way that my teacher explained to me in the classroom is not really that's happening in this world. So I think what we're trying to say is that identity is a mechanism for us to understand the complexity of the workplace, rather than saying that assuming a particular identity position will make you more successful or less successful in the workplace.
Yeah.
Maybe slightly different, Jean. Maybe you're more of a Taoist, and the work here is more Confucian, where you've got different identities through life, you know?
Yeah.
But who knows? That's far too philosophical for a business and economics event. Yeah. But there's Duncan wants to ask a question as well. Duncan.
Yes, thank you very much indeed for your talk. Very enlightening. I'm always really a bit concerned about the way in which early 20th century anthropologists automatically universalized things out of their anthropological observations. So you have this universal, right, which the man you quoted, Van Gennep, etc., right, referred to as being liminality. So from liminality, then, you get this idea, which is what I think Jean Bolton was also trying to tackle, this idea that there is virtually a worldwide process of people being and becoming. Well, whereas if you really look at these concepts, these are what Wittgenstein calls hinge concepts. You know, if I want to open a door, I have to assume there is a hinge. And the hinge is really liminality. And there are so many different liminalities, so many that I think to a certain extent, the purchase of this as a universal needs to be carefully looked at. What worries me is that because the concept is obscure and difficult to make plain.
Maybe there'll be some over the road. I can't help you at the moment. And difficult to make plain, right? We're holding back on what would be the genuine way in which we can make work into a more humanistic approach. And one particular thing is that I wouldn't distinguish between the way in which you've talked about people coping with work and what McKinsey would call cultural influence. Okay, there's different ways in which you adapt, but boy, oh, you'd better adapt in the end.
So is that So can you just rephrase your question in one line, Duncan?
Yes. Do we have to pay attention to the hinge every single time we try and open a door? And therefore, is the concept totally meaningless?
Okay. So there's a bit of a challenge for you, Farooq. Is liminality an empty concept?
I think the idea of a hinge is really interesting. I did not think about liminality as a hinge that is opening these doors, but I really appreciate this is a very, very interesting concept. In terms of how a workplace is influencing, or the culture, for example, of a workplace or an organization is influencing the mindset of how an individual works. For me, if I were to conceptualize an organization, first of all, I would do it in ways. First of all, I think from a business perspective, organization is a moving concern. So it's moving at a certain speed, it's moving at a certain rate. And in order for us to make sure or ensure that we have a new breed of individuals who are work ready by the time they graduate and they have some experience or some kind of an understanding of who they want to be and how they're going to be part of, I think if that goes a long way in reducing the expectation reality gap, and a lot of individuals fear that their expectations of how to be in a workplace and the reality is different. So now I was initially quite skeptical about using philosophical concepts, but the quality of questions has really forced me to think about organizations in a very philosophical point of view. So I do a lot of work on. I'm a constructivist. My ontological worldview would say I'm a constructivist. I see things, people learning and constructing a very particular way. But if you look at organizations, I think there are structures which are structuring our identities, or at least the way we think about ourselves or our self-conceptions. So for me, from an organizational and a philosophical point of view, I think organizational workspaces are structured and structuring at the same time. So it's a constructivist paradigm, but it's a constructivist, structuralist paradigm, where I think that we are being influenced by the work we do, but we are also influencing the work that we are doing. And especially this is more intensely felt by interns, because for them, they might not have that experience of opening up different doors, and every door might have a different opportunity for them. So I think the way we've categorized or the way we've grouped our interns into different identity positions, in fact, tell us about either they've conformed to the structures that are structuring the way they are doing their work, and if so, when they're going to move out into the real world, are they going to be people who are conformist, who conform to what organizations want them to be doing, or will they adapt, or will they resist? So I think a lot has to do with how we've been reared, kind of experiences we've had, and when we take all of our dispositions or predispositions into that real world, I think those structures work to kind of either change those predispositions, and when they start changing them, I think we feel a disconnect, and that is the conflict that I think is Liminalities is addressing. But again, your question has really made me think more deeply about this concept of liminality, and thank you very much.
That's what we like to hear, Farooq, that the audience makes you think. That's a good thing.
It's a learning process.
Okay, let me just, before you go on, let me just get to somebody else. I'll come back to you, Duncan.
I just want to say that the quotation comes from Wittgenstein's On Certainty, section 34 to 343, right? On Certainty.
On Certainty. There you go. Some homework for you, Farooq.
Absolutely. Right. And thank you very much. Thank you.
And I think Joe had a question as well. You just need to unmute yourself, Joe.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Farooq. Really, really interesting subject. Before my question, I just thought I'd pick up on something. It was interesting that Duncan raised the anthropological aspect, because just hearing your talk made me think that surely it's not a coincidence that most societies have very well-formed rituals around the liminal moments in life's journey, and most of those rituals or a lot of those rituals involve transformation from being someone who you were previously to someone different who you are after. But that's not my question. My question is more related to the managerial side of things. I was interested that I was particularly interested in the point that in liminal moments, people can display creativity or can have greater creativity. And I think I'm right in thinking that Einstein's Annus Mirabilis came at the time when he just had his first child. He'd graduated, and he had that 1 year, was it 1904, 1905 or something, where most of his theories became formed when he was a young man. So my question is, from a managerial point of view, could you imagine such a thing as designed liminality or intended liminality amongst one's teams? Could you foster a form of liminality to generate creativity?
I think that's a fascinating point of view. So in our work so far, we haven't been looking into innovation and creativity and how liminality could spark creativity amongst team. But I think one example that comes to my mind is of Google. So as an organization, and I think this is more kind of a stereotypical example, but I think it helps me explain what you're trying to say. In the past, I've read that, and I've read literature which suggests that what Google does is that Google kind of maps our daily work routines. It maps what we do. It has enormous amounts of information about individuals when they come into the workplace, what they do when they go out. They keep logs of their practices and routines. One of the things that they kind of do is that they try moving around people from one group to another group. So they do this deliberately, which they call the G2G or the Googler to Googler network, because they believe that when individuals are moving or transitioning from one role to the other, they're more open to learning. And in fact, I think what you're trying to say is that can we design something like which can actually spark this innovation because we are already open to learning. I think Google is already doing that. So far, we haven't been able to spot anything in our database, but I think it's something that we can look at, because one of the things that really comes to my mind from our research that we're doing is that those individuals who are regulated adapters who try resisting identity labels, but they try to position themselves more creatively in the firm. So they're not confused outsiders. So they are not they're not outliers. They're part of the what we call the identity work triangle, which considers the conditions, which considers our roles, which considers our relationships. They're not positioned centrally like recognized insiders. They're part of the whole organization, but they are showing creativity in terms of what they want to be and how they want to position themselves. But it's interesting that none of our participants actually identified whether an organization, but there is a possibility, and I'd be really interested in exploring more of that.
Okay, good. I mean, from my perspective, just to add to what Farooq was saying, is in order to have creativity as a potential, you need to have a suspension of judgment at the beginning. Yeah, if you already come with your own prejudices in terms of the structure of how things are, you're not going to be particularly creative. You're just going to be executing against a particular pre-known paradigm. Whereas if you're open to change and you're suspending your judgment and you're trying to approach things from a different perspective deliberately, you're more likely to come up with something new rather than the same.
I think there are examples in university and business school education where teachers have used liminality as a threshold concept to actually spark creativity in solving case studies. So I know for that. I've read literature, but it's still yet to be explored in our research. But yeah. Thank you very much.
Good. Now we've got. It says Roski. You're obviously not called Roski. Can you unmute yourself and then you can ask your question?
Hi, it's Catherine. I'm not really Roski.
Hello, Catherine.
Hi. Well, really fascinating for me to hear your talk, Farooq. I've just started a PhD in fine art recently, and I'm looking at precisely this area, looking at liminality as a way of harnessing creativity. And as part of my master's in education, I built a liminal learning model where I deliberately created a learning model that embraced threshold concepts of liminality to foster and generate creativity in my learners. So it's really interesting what you're saying about it from an identity formation perspective in a business environment, because obviously I'm very much coming from a very creative fine art perspective. Now at the moment I'm deliberately searching out physical liminal spaces and making artwork in those spaces, like tunnels, subways, odd transient spaces, to heighten that sense of liminality, and then for the viewer to engage in that physical space, but then to be able to inhabit a psychological state of liminality in order to be able to, embrace it and withstand it, rather than, like you mentioned, it's a natural fear point. Most people are very frightened of it. So there's a way of increasing tolerance, and then there's an ultimate way of enabling them to harness its creative potential. So yeah, really fascinating what you were saying about how you're getting fixed identity points. And I think what Jean was saying about, but do you want fixed identity points? Because I think for me that I'm trying to deliberately stay in that space. It's a bit like a training activity to sort of withstand that uncomfortableness and that anxiety. And I think, like you say, at the moment, pandemic is such sort of a world liminal experience. It's such a metaphor for that sense of liminality. Most people find it very, very difficult. So yeah, I think it's really interesting. So that's the aim of my research, try and build a creative space that'll help people withstand that state.
I think that's a fascinating concept, to use liminality as a way to withstand and to spark creativity. And I'd be very interested in knowing more about how art can really trigger that kind of innovation or creativity. That would be fascinating.
Very good. Mike, you want to ask a question? Then it's Lynn. So Mike first, and then Lynn. Do you want to unmute yourself, Mike, or shall I try to do
Go on, try again. Done it, right. Okay, thanks. Thank you, Farooq. I must confess, when you were talking, my mind was moving along similar but less precise lines to Jean. And I was sort of thinking, I'm not sure. And really, something Joe said sort of triggered and sort of catalysed what I was thinking. In previous societies, there were very definite transition points. There were rites of passage. And you moved from childhood to adulthood, or possibly it was a two-stage process. You moved from early childhood to some sort of in-between area, and then on. There were also other rites of passage, like marriage, when you moved from suddenly being single to suddenly being in a partnership. It's interesting that in society, in general, those definite, not only the rites of passage, but the actual definite periods have gone. In childhood, a child will move through many, many periods, all of them slightly different. And all of them now, partly for commercial reasons, all have their own particular name and label, and the child will endlessly move on. And so it seems to me that there are not particular liminal spaces. There is just one huge liminal space. And I suspect that's also true to a certain extent in modern organizations. In fact, the very flatness of modern organizations tends to make that the case. People don't transition from one rank of the hierarchy to another, but they shift about with sort of moving along that flat parallel surface, perhaps with some different degrees of seniority. So I'm just wondering really whether there are, either everything is one big liminal space, or there are no liminal spaces.
I think that's a fascinating question, and I don't think I might have an answer for that. But what I consider from my research and what I've come to know is that if we are exposed to certain influences where we're unable to make sense of who we are, so if you're unable to achieve plausibility and coherence, we're continuously in a liminal space or in a liminal state. But like you've said, we don't have those clear points anymore in the modern society, because everything seems to be more fluid. And like children, for example, I have a daughter, and now looking at the influences she's open to at a very young age, she has a very different identity, and that identity keeps on changing. It's not that she's stuck to one particular identity, but I think the more influences we are exposed to in our lives, the more we challenge our self-concepts. I think we are constantly in a recursive identity spin, and if you're unable to get to a point where we think that this is a point where I think that I've achieved something in my life, but yet again another thing comes along the way in our organizations. I think we are, you're right, in a way we're constantly redefining ourselves as we move along, because society is moving at a phenomenal pace. We're living in a fast-moving world, and I think the concept of identity is being challenged in quite a lot these days. And like Jean was mentioning, is there a fixed identity position, or are we still trying to understand our identity, and is it even thinking about it in terms of identity? So I think we might be suspended a bit more in the liminal space unless we resolve our psychosocial conflicts, or the conflicts that we face which challenge our self-concepts. That is at least what we've come to know from our research. So those students or those individuals who've been able to resolve their psychosocial conflicts have transitioned more quickly through the internship space than those who found it more difficult to do so.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Now, Lynn, you also had a question. I'm just going to unmute you, Lynn.
I'm unmuted.
Yes, you are, Lynn. You're up.
Right. Thank you very much, Farooq. That was very provocative and thought-provoking. I'm a psychotherapist, and in psychotherapy and psychoanalytic literature, there's a massive amount on liminality and the liminal space, because, of course, that's the rich mine that we dig in order to help people to change if that's what's wanted. And I could ask you loads of questions and challenge some ideas that Jean and others have done, because I think that tolerating uncertainty is a task of maturity, a task of individuating, to use Jung's word, Carl Jung. But my question is, a couple of times you referred to offering help or support or guidance to young people here, which you're mostly thinking about. Do you have counseling for those people? Because counseling and psychotherapy as well are very useful, because it allows people to express their anxieties and doubts. And by expressing them, they're able to begin to identify them and locate them, and then recognize where they have choice and maybe where they don't have choice. Anyway, that's my question.
I think so. So the organizations we've looked at where these interns have been working, not all organizations have provided enough mentoring, support, or counseling to these interns. And what we've seen, that this process of liminality that they're dealing with on their own, it's again, it invokes uncertainty. It challenges their concepts. But the most important thing that we've come to know is that it's an isolating process. That if individuals or young people are not provided with enough support, they find the roles that they're doing alienating, and if they start thinking about in terms that their work roles are alienating, then they find very little meaning in performing those roles. So I think those who are supporting or working with young people, especially in our research, who are transitioning or are planning to transition, internships are a major life-changing event, and I'm sure from a psychological point of view, you could understand that if these individuals who acquire negative work experiences, or in fact they lead into developing fractured identities without any support, I think it develops cynical behavior or negative feelings towards work, and I think it has negative consequences for psychological well-being. I think professionals, and we are trying to convince organizations to organize counseling sessions and discussions to clarify the transcendental importance behind their existence and help them rediscover their new identities, or at least help them talk through their experiences, that by listening to their concerns as you were mentioning. So I think this would our work with these interns, or at least looking into liminality, would help evolve some kind of a mechanism to overcome these negative feelings that makes these young people or individuals more vulnerable to change and be a meaningful part of their workplace. But none of them that we've looked so far have been offering any formalized counseling. There have been informal support. There has been informal support from supervisors, from peers, but not everyone has really offered something very concrete.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, Farooq, and thank you for the question. And it just shows how interdisciplinary liminality really is. We've got a psychoanalyst, we've got a philosopher, we've got a complexity expert, we've got a poet, you've got me and Joe on as well as interested laymen. So I think you've got a ready-made working party here, Farooq, to explore liminality on a much wider basis. But I think we've run out of time, unfortunately. So sorry to anybody else who wanted to ask a question. But if I unmute you all and we can once again show our appreciation to Farooq. Let me just give it a second for people to unmute. Excellent. And the clap is begin. Thank you very much, Farooq.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Very good. Very good. And thank you very much, Farooq, for an excellent conversation. I really enjoyed it. I know the audience are nodding and really enjoyed it as well, which is great. Just to let everybody know what's coming up next on philosophy, because there's also philosophical discussion today. We're going to have a talk by Don Cameron, the lead convener for philosophy. I'm just his sidekick. He's going to give a talk on free will and determinism. So that should be quite interesting because that plays into, our capacity to actually make decisions and might have a liminal aspect to it. And then yours truly in business and economics will do a talk in the next 4 weeks or so by the title of The Organization as an Organism. So that is building on complexity, basically saying, an organization is not a machine, but it's an organism, a living and breathing ecosystem or biosphere. So I hope you will join us for those talks. And finally, it would be really helpful. I always ask for feedback. So you see my name on the screen at the moment. It's Andreas Wasmuth. If you just say, if you want to email me and give me feedback on the meeting today, but also just meetings in general by Zoom, whether they're working for you and whether you like them, my email address is andreas.wasmuth, so just the dot between the two names, and then at brlsi.org. Very simple, brlsi.org. So if you have got any feedback, any questions, any suggestions for future programs, please let me know. We always want to sort of put on new and innovative content. And I think we certainly achieved that today with Farooq and exploring liminality. So Farooq, thank you very much again.
Thank you very much.
And good night to everybody. Stay safe, stay well, and I shall see you next time. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.